Hello and welcome. My name is Helen Gray and I'm an international leader here at Iðan Education Center here in Iceland. We're here today to talk a little bit about and reflect on a report that the NVL Network for Working Life and Digital Transformation is involved in with the University of Aalborg in Denmark. Iðan and the Education Training Service Center here in Iceland are members of this NVL network, and NVL stands for Nordic Voksnes Læring, or Nordic Adult Education. And today we have with us Dr. Tryggvi Thayer. Tryggvi is from the university, or works at the University of Iceland for the School of Education, and he is responsible for the development of academic studies. We asked Tryggvi to be with us here today to kind of reflect on the 5 recommendations that are put forth in this report. Tryggvi is going to kind of reflect on the recommendations, a little bit about the approach, and kind of help us look a little bit towards the future. And this is really important for us to do because it's important for us to share the results from this report and how we can proceed. So Tryggvi, please, we look forward to hearing from you now.
Thank you, Helen. So first I want to thank the authors for this report. It's obvious that they've done a very thorough analysis and research project and produced some very interesting results here. And particularly the recommendations at the end, that I think they are certainly quite relevant. The one thing that I think is sort of lacking in the overall approach that is adopted here is perhaps an element of foresight. And there is not much mention of foresight or futures specifically, or futures research in this. And it could be that that would be a different research project, but I think it certainly would be a very relevant one to expand on what we have here. And if we just go through, and I'm going to go through the recommendations and say some words about each of these, and I think that will strengthen some of my points regarding my comments about futures and foresight. And if we take the first recommendation, implementing timely slowliness, and this is something that we've certainly heard before, but my concern here is that the changes that we are dealing with in terms of the workforce skills needs, etc., is really driven by increasingly rapid change. And in many cases, there's simply not an opportunity for timely slowness, that the skills that are needed very quickly or very soon. And so here, especially, I would say, in terms of timely slowness, if you're going to go that route to enable yourself to use timely slowness, then you need to have some fairly concrete idea of what future you're aspiring to. So a futures and foresight element within this research project would really enable this timely slowness, right? So that if we know where we're heading well ahead of time, then we can implement timely slowness in a manner consistent with the recommendations here. But all too often, I think that the changes that are being dealt with, that these are just-in-time changes, just-in-time skills needs, and a timely slowness is really not something that many businesses can afford in terms of the digital transformations that are taking place today. Prioritizing a broad repertoire of strategies to navigate the digital transition and digital transformations. I think this is pretty much a no-brainer, that of course, if companies are able to develop strategic plans that lay out where they can head in terms of dealing with digital transformations before those transformations become burdensome, then that makes sense. And that certainly goes back to what I said about the first point, that here, of course, we need to have at least some fairly workable, usable vision of the possible futures that we can aspire to, we being then companies and organizations, to be able to develop the strategies that allow us to create roadmaps, flexible roadmaps, that we can say, okay, we appear to be heading in this direction, we're going to need those skills. And so again, there, the foresight and futures element is really, to me, more requisite than optional, shall we say. Creating attention in practice on context. And I think that this is actually a point that I think the authors make throughout the research that they're reporting on here, this element of context and how important it is. And I couldn't agree more. And I think that, for example, the design-based research approach that the authors have adopted, that to me, design, use of that term in that context always implies that we are focusing on individuals in their real contexts. And so certainly creating practices or attentions in practice that emphasize that importance of the context is very important. Now, in the next recommendation, I think we get to a somewhat difficult and problematic theme. Now, this is the one about including the workforce's forms of knowledge as legitimate. And I think I couldn't agree more, and I think that there's a wealth of futures research that has shown us that if we're going to prepare for a future in which digital transformations are going to disrupt businesses and organizations, prompting new practices, then the knowledge, and it can be the tacit and implicit knowledge of the workers who have been associated with the practices that we're dealing with, that their knowledge is key, and it's very important. And I think that we have to think that, for example, if we're going to replace carpenters with machines, that we can't do that without the carpenters, because we need their knowledge input to be able to do this. But therein lies really the issue and the problem, the challenge, if we may, that we are essentially asking for people's knowledge in order to be able to replace them with machines. And I don't see them being, the workers being particularly motivated by this. And one can very easily see situations arise where they simply might refuse. And this is documented in some research, and certainly in educational research where I do most of my work, that we see, for example, how teachers will often place great importance on elements of the subjects that they teach in order to not have them done away with in the educational system, because to the teacher, it's essentially saying, you're not as important now as you were. And so I think that this question, or this recommendation of including the workforce's forms of knowledge in digital transformation, that we need to think about how we do this, because that has to be, I think, a very diplomatic method that we employ there, and something that certainly legitimates the workers, knowledge, but still doesn't rob them of their sense of self-worth. So there's an ethical challenge there, and there's also a strategic challenge. And I think that one of the things that we have to consider, especially in terms of this kind of recommendation, and when working with the workers, is we have to think about where their place in the post-transformation future will be. And we have to be able to make that quite concrete to them to be able to solicit their help in achieving those transformations. So the last recommendation regarding the competence development courses with courses on context understanding, that I see this very much in relation with the previous recommendation on context, that here again, of course, context is very important, and I think that that this is certainly on par with the overall conclusions of the research report. But again, here I think that we have to think in terms of the workers' futures. That essentially, when we are talking about upskilling with workers, then we have to think about this in terms of not just upskilling them within their present employment context, but what sort of future context they are preparing themselves for. And so again, here I get to the element of the futures and the foresight. And this is, again, sort of finally, that one of the things that I think would strengthen this research tremendously is if there was an element of some sort of foresight and futures research to reinforce and support some of the recommendations being made here. And I think that that there's certainly room for it within the research project. And I would certainly recommend to the researchers that they consider how they might be able to develop the vignettes that form part of the outcomes of the research as scenarios, forward-looking scenarios that can be examined in greater detail in a participative manner. Then we're talking about organization leaders and workers to explore what are the possible futures that digital transformations are opening up for us, and what are the ones that are worth pursuing. Because when we start talking about the future, we always have to be sort of aware that from our current point of reference, that there is no one single future, but rather numerous possible futures. And it's up to us maybe to employ our facilities or faculties for foresight to be able to choose the futures that best align with what we want in our future. And as I say, the recommendations here are very forward-looking. And so I think some element of that foresight would strengthen what we have here rather than anything else.
Thank you, Tryggvi. This was, I think, really interesting, and you kind of led us through these 5 steps and a little bit about the approach. What I take away from this is that time is essential. We need roadmaps. The element of context in practice is really, really important. And that the knowledge and the competences of the workers is totally essential for any transformation. But it's a very, very fine line. And I think that is really of interest, the way you approach this. And we really have to look at everything in a certain context. So, and Tryggvi, thank you for being with us here today.